So, to infinity and beyond is something that Buzz Lightyear said in Toy Story. Now, this might sound super cheesy, but I like to think that API docs writers are a lot more powerful than some people like to believe, and so this is an idea I want to connect together. So I'm the lead community engineer at a company called Stoplight, as was mentioned, and I work on everything from helping users use OpenAPI. Probably on any given month I've helped a couple hundred users use OpenAPI, so I've seen a lot of different setups, a lot of different environments. Before, I worked at a company called Keen.io, which was a data analytics API. I also have some examples of our docs that I worked on before, and I managed SDKs there, developer community, and our documentation that had thousands of views each week. But first, I want to talk about this idea of a single source of truth. Wikipedia says that this is the practice of structuring information models and associated data schemas such that every data element is stored exactly once. It's super wordy, but the way I like to look at it, it's a contract. It's something that both multiple parties, multiple teams agree on, and we can build around. As much as some people would like to think, self-documenting APIs do not exist, because APIs are this intersection of humans and machines, and so we need something to bridge them together, and that's where I see API specifications sit. It's this idea of bridges are going to come up a lot in this talk. I'm going to gauge this. I'm not going to really go into this super deep, but I just want to ask a couple of questions. If you could raise your hand. Who feels like I'm not going to ask you to answer it, but who feels comfortable answering this question right now with show of hands? Okay, that's interesting. And then, who is currently using it in your role right now? Okay. And the last question is, who knows it's being used at your organization for anything other than API reference? Like other testing or mocking or design or things like that. Okay, that's perfect, because that's what I want to talk about and why that's relevant to writers. So I was first introduced to APIspec about 4 years ago when I worked at a startup. It was API Blueprint, and I found the whole experience quite painful. I'm glad to say that I feel like this experience 4 years later is a lot better with OpenAPI and the tooling that's been built around it. But basically, it is a standard. It's a structured approach for describing APIs. It's descriptions with specific properties that machines can process, so we can build tooling on top of it. And it was initially called Swagger, which was connected to SmartBear software. It's now become a more vendor-neutral specification. It has its own initiative around it. Now Swagger refers more to the tooling, but some people still refer to it Swagger, so that's why I just wanted to connect those. So if you're like, what are these two things, and how are they related? And historically, it's been seen as something that helps you auto-generate API reference docs, which I hope I can convince you that it's not just that today. There's this quote, I don't have a lot of quotes in here, but this one I really like, that OpenAPI is a bridge to understanding and be able to communicate around HTTP as a transport, and our greatest hope for helping people learn their HTTPs and 1-2-3s. Initially, people said developers, but I think it's broader than that, especially API documentation writers. And this was from Ken Lane from a blog post, basically. He's really fighting in his consulting, trying to break out of that it's not just API references, too. And so, like I said, I want to talk about these hidden benefits that are outside just being able to generate an API reference, which we've seen some examples in different people's talks today. And so, like I said, it's not just that. Some of the things, it's a development contract. It helps prototyping or mocking, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Contract testing, which is just testing whether your specification matches the implementation of your API, or your specification matches the SDKs that you're creating, or the docs. It's also being able to auto-generate client SDKs. And it also is able to help you create server stubs for implementation. Some of those matter more to the engineering side, but what I think for writers, the biggest one is it allows you to go ahead and do your work while the API is still being developed. And so that's that idea of a contract. We've decided this is what the API is going to look like. These are the endpoints and the responses, and we sometimes already have examples, or we're creating the examples. And so it empowers you to start sooner on the documentation and not be something that comes at the tail end. And also, around this contract, I see it as a bridge. So the idea of silos was talked about in the last talk. I feel like this contract or specification brings together those silos, because we can all talk about this one specification rather than, oh, these are what the docs look like and this is what the API implementation looks like. There's something connecting the two together. But there will always be manual work. Until the AI bots are more human than the humans, there will be things for us to do. And I've heard writers sometimes in like the Write the Docs Slack and other places be like, my company's now using OpenAPI, what do I do? And my answer is the good stuff. You get to spend time on things that maybe you had a little less time on, like now that the API reference is a little bit more taken care of, you can spend time on the descriptions inside the API reference at the different endpoints. Or spend more time on guides and tutorials, which honestly are a huge chunk to the overall developer experience. You can also find ways to use references, because OpenAPI has this idea of refs. We've started doing this more at Stoplight, but other tools like DapperDocs, which are allowing you to put refs inside of a bigger guide or tutorial. So maybe you just want to reference one endpoint and then write some other markdown around it and then reference something else, so you can have multiple steps. And the awesome thing about that is then when you update the spec, so say a data type changed, you don't have to go in and change that. It's just automatically updated. And so then you can also spend more time just worrying about what is the actual experience of using these docs, rather than just do they exist. It's also a tool for collaboration. Filling in a spec is kind of like filling in a form. It simplifies writing. We all know like a blank page with no structure is really hard to start. And it gives you guidance and structure around the conversations you're having between engineering and product or whatever other team you're interfacing with. It also standardizes terminology, so kind of like a style guide. It gives you a language to speak and communicate with others. The other day, also in the Write the Docs Slack, I hang out there sometimes and I see really interesting conversations. And one of them, somebody asked a question and they used this one term, and then they later realized they meant something else. Having a specification to refer back to, like you can decide, okay, we mean host name or base path, and you can all talk about it rather than everybody having a different name for something. There's also this idea of API fastness, which is a term from API Handyman. You can look him up on Twitter. He coined it mostly to be focused on building well-designed and secure APIs faster, but I also think a large portion of that is being able to build better docs. So being able to, when you're all on the same page and you don't have to spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the engineers are communicating in the same language as the technical writers, you can then just get certain things done faster. And this is the biggest one. It enhances developer experience. So I'm going to break this up into a few parts, but API docs writers are critical to the whole developer experience. If it wasn't for writers, a lot of docs would barely exist. And sometimes people forget about this. Y'all don't probably need to know this, because y'all already know this, but I just feel like it needs to be said, especially since why I'm going to break down these four. Design first, mocking, testing, and feedback. With design first, so typically there are three ways people get a spec. A lot of times people are auto-generating it from their code. They're writing in code annotations and then generating it. The second way, creating through design first principles, so they start with the spec before any API code has been written, usually through product and engineering. And number three, they're creating it from scratch, which is kind of the most painful of all. Like, I have a lot of sympathy and some empathy for docs writers who are been told, we want to use OpenAPI specifications, here's the API, go create the specification for us. It's definitely a thing that happens. I mostly want to focus on the second one as a best practice, but I'll give some tips on the first and third one throughout. So design first. OpenAPI is heavily about making sure you have your API implemented in a consistent way with all the standardization and all that stuff. Because when you have a standard, then the API turns out a little bit more consistent in the end, even though you can still design things badly even with the specification. Doesn't totally prevent it, but it helps a little bit. We've seen that the code first approach can be really expensive if changes need to be made later, especially if you're getting into versioning and versioning docs and all versioning SDKs. And so it's a little bit easier on the whole experience of development, including writing, if we can try to insert some design first principles early on. We've seen that having a contract early on also leads to fewer versions. Sometimes also people will create a spec but barely actually test it, and that leads to the second one, which is mocking. So this is kind of what is helping you make less mistakes in the design. At Stoplight, we say mocking is, we define it kind of as routing incoming requests to example responses or dynamically generating examples on the fly from the specification. A few mock server tools are out there. One of my teammates maintains one called Prism that's really popular, and it's really hard to do mocking without a design first approach. With the code first, there's a lot of coding that engineering would have to do for you to be able to test out the API and start learning about what you're going to need to document. And so when the specification and you can use a mock server, it allows you to start getting that interactivity a lot earlier. And so why is this important to writers? Tom Johnson from I'd Rather Be Writing says that if you have access to the API early on, you probably have a lot more opinions than you think. You're someone who's on the outside. You're not on the engineering team. A lot of times that developed API, you're almost closer to the end user, and you're the one that's going to have to explain it to the end user. So being able to get your hands on and mock and try out the different endpoints early on is really good. So some of the questions you can ask is, what are the tasks users want to accomplish? Will the API help them achieve these tasks? And are the endpoints confusing? If you could really get a hold of some users, that would be awesome, but starting and asking these questions of yourself is a great starting place. And I say, start with humans, because this whole idea of APIs being a mixture of humans and machines, being able to get concrete feedback is really important for that overall developer experience. Also, one of the reasons why some people like OpenAPI is because you can have that try it out functionality, like sandbox type functionality, and mocking is how that's all working. That's just API responses being mocked. The third one is testing. Testing can mean a lot of different things, but I want to focus on what's relevant to writers and the overall developer experience. So testing you can make sure you have accurate docs. So one of the examples of that is verifying that the docs match the specification. That can be automated with tools like Dread, which is an API docs testing tool, or it can even be kind of manually done if you don't have the ability to code that up. And also verify that requests and data types match the specification. There's also a tool now called Speccy, S-P-E-C-C-Y. I think that's how it's pronounced. And it's basically like validating specs by a style guide, which is really awesome. You can also do different types of testing of the actual API descriptions, which writers are a lot of times writing, to make sure it follows whatever style guide you'd like to follow. For me, This also relates to less support overhead. So when I was at Keen.io, we had a PHP SDK that a user came in through a community channel and was getting a response. It was like, they're supposed to be getting an array, and I forgot they were getting something totally different. And so then I had to look at this in 3 different ways. I had to look at what is the code the user's actually using from the SDK, try that out. I'm not a PHP developer, so get that environment set up and stumble through that. Then go to the API team. Has something changed with this? We weren't using specifications, so has something changed with this API that I don't know about? Then go to the SDK and look at the commit history. What changes have we made recently? It was like a day and a half of work, basically. If we had a specification, we could have caught that in 2 different times. One, I'm seeing really cool examples. SendGrid does this, where they're testing pull requests to their SDKs against the spec. So that's like another form of contract testing in the whole CI process. So if someone were to change their SDK and it didn't match the spec's response, it would get flagged before it was even merged. So that error would have never even happened. Or I could have just looked at the spec and been like, okay, it's supposed to be this. So at least that resolves one of the 3 things that I had to go through. And the last one's feedback. That's another topic that's come up, especially in like the Typeform talk. And this could be a whole talk, like how to do docs feedback. I want to focus on related to OpenAPI specifications and how to get feedback through them. Ken Lane, API Evangelist, says that making a spec public is the centerpiece as a feedback loop with your community when you have an API. These are just some of the companies that have put their spec up on GitHub. SendGrid gets feedback from outside contributors. Azure, I mean, many of those are probably Microsoft employees, but the fact that they have 440 people contributing to their spec is just amazing. That's like, I can't even comprehend that. Slack, Stripe, New York Times, just a bunch of others. And when it's up on GitHub, it's easier for users to give you useful feedback that you can take to an engineering team. I've had users give me really vague feedback, and I have to like dig to try to like, why do they not like something in the API design? And when they can actually see how it's implemented, they can be like, I don't like this data type on this specific endpoint, which is useful for me to actually take to engineering. And last part is the reality of all this. Like, this is best practice. These are what we're trying to work towards. The question of who creates a spec, it's a big one. Maybe you're in an organization where developers are totally on board. I've seen those. They're rare. Maybe they have no idea the benefits. They think it's just auto-generation, and then they don't have to write docs because it's auto-generated for them. And they have no idea that there's these other parts to it and these things that can make their jobs as API engineers easier. And I think that's kind of where we come in, because if we have a view of the spec and this idea of this single source of truth, we can try to push them along and at least show examples and in different ways that could be useful to them. I found also product managers are a really great resource because they have a larger scope. They maybe interface with QA, and so testing things. They maybe interface with product and engineering. They can, if you can win them over, you have an ally, basically. And then also, just getting ahead of the curve, inserting yourself into the process. So if you find out that they're going to be using OpenAPI, start, sharing all the things they could do if they start with like a better design first best practice and things like that. And we still haven't figured out all the things with OpenAPI. That's kind of the infinity part of this talk. What exactly is infinity? I've seen some really awesome things with linting for the actual docs side and the style of the API. I've seen really cool style guides related to it, people putting it in their continuous integration and deployment processes, testing docs, putting it just deeper into the development process, making it a core part of how they build APIs. Some say we should be building better APIs. I think we should be building API experiences, because that brings the writers more into the process rather than just API design coming from engineering. And so this is my challenge. What would allow you to focus more on the overall API experience? And when you think about that, I've seen a lot of different environments, so if you want to chat about that, I'll try to help. And I also work with a lot of talented engineers who also think about these things all day. So yeah, thank you.